Greetings and salutations. Welcome back to an Everything Astronomy holiday special. My name is still Joe, and today we're joined by the whole team, Sam, Tom, and Michael. We thought it would be interesting to go over our favorite moments of the last year and talk about what our podcast is going to look like moving forward. So, first, Michael, why did we start the podcast?
Sure. And so if you haven't seen the full episode, we made our first Not So Serious episode focusing on exactly that, why we started the podcast episode. But to go over it briefly, the four of us met in our introductory astronomy class at Michigan our freshman year. And then our sophomore year, we were all in the same physics class. And we wanted to do something together. So we were all somewhat doing research individually. And so at first we thought about kind of doing a collective research project. And we realized that it's not necessarily feasible. Then we eventually came up with the idea, after meeting for a few times, to start a podcast. We had a lot of professors. Almost all of our professors had really interesting stories and also really interesting research subjects. And we thought that a podcast would be a perfect opportunity and platform to share those stories out with a larger audience, whether those be undergraduate students at our university or even just people from the public. And so with our podcast, we kind of want to demonstrate that kind of like the inside view of how astronomy, how science works, but also to demonstrate that science is for everyone, and that no matter what your background is or your experience, everyone can find interest in science somehow, some way.
And so the other thing, one of the other reasons why I wanted to do this is because we realize that many people go into science for different reasons, and you have people who are interested you have tons of different aspects and facets within science. So you might think that all scientists act and behave and do roughly the same thing, but it surprisingly, well, at least to me, even people who work within the same field do spend their time wildly differently. And so we thought it would be interesting to talk about these stories and to share the different interests, motivations, reasons for going into science, and ranging from professors to grad students to anyone else who has a role in science.
Right, and I think what we're learning as we're going along is that there's a lot of diversity actually with different people that we find, and the different stories like Joe mentioned that they have. And so I think just to kick things off in terms of just like what happened this past year, we recorded I believe 8 episodes total. I think just to highlight some favorite moments, I think just to start off, I think our first episode, I think to me stuck out the most, just because before we started the podcast, we spent I'd say 3-4 months just planning everything out and trying to finalize a format for what we wanted to exactly do, how we wanted things to go, what we wanted our podcast to center around. And so when we finally got to record our first episode with Professor Lamone, and actually be in the recording room, like rent out the camera, have the mic on the table, set up everything,
right.
Buy our coffee and everything, like have everything planned out. It was actually really cool just to see what we had been planning for like come to fruition finally. And so I think in terms of just our past year and what we've done, I think that was one of the biggest steps that we've taken, just because we finally got things off the ground and things started. And I think it was a really great experience to just be in that room. And I think once everything settles down, I'm excited to get back into that kind of recording in the same room as a professor environment, just because it was really great, and I really miss it, honestly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that first episode was really good, but one of my other favorite moments, obviously, everyone's been dealing with COVID, so I'd have to say like one of my other favorite moments is that first episode we recorded on Zoom with Professor Meyer. Just transitioning to a different type of format than we had originally planned on for the first couple months before we recorded that Lamone episode, and kind of showing different ways that we could be versatile and develop the podcast. And obviously we've stick to Zoom for now for COVID reasons, but seeing how we're able to transition to Zoom calls and doing podcasts virtually, and how we developed that we've had to do it on a virtual call rather than in person with the cameras. And so honestly, I think that's also a big achievement for us as a group, just seeing how we've developed over time with different circumstances.
And it was also interesting to see how we kind of changed. Well, I thought I also liked how we kind of changed the way that we did episodes as we kind of went through. We started off with Professor Lamone, and then we we thought about our format ideas, and we had a plan, and that's the plan that we tried to carry forward. But then we realized that maybe that way of talking to professors and that way of doing these podcasts wasn't what was bringing out the most interesting stuff necessarily. And so I really liked talking to people about the other facets of their jobs and their interests. For example, when we talked to Alex Wormley, she isn't a scientist, in the lab coat that looks at the star sense, but she is a scientist in the sense that she's interested in learning and discovering how things work. And I really love talking to her about how people learn to think and how people change in different environments surrounding space. So that was a pretty cool moment, I thought.
Michael's muted.
And then to go along with that, I would say my favorite episode was the one with Tamu. And I think when we originally started the podcast, our idea was to kind of talk with professors specifically at our university, because they seemed most accessible, and we had kind of experienced during their classes and lectures what their research was and what their stories are. And we wanted to use the podcast as a platform to share that. But Tamu was the first example where we weren't interviewing a professor. And we didn't reach out to him. He reached out to us because he was a graduate and alumni of the University of Michigan. And he saw our podcast and was interested in being a guest on it and talking about his interests, not only in astronomy, but specifically astrophotography, and kind of sharing his interests with us on the podcast. So that was probably one of my favorite episodes, just because it was definitely different than what we had originally planned with our podcast guests. And moving forwards, I think we saw that a lot of our listeners and audience enjoyed those episodes with non-professors. And so we tried to continue that with bringing in graduate students onto the podcast and not just sticking with professors.
Yeah, I mean, Temu and the few that we had after as well, who weren't professors, but who were other actors in the field of science, I thought that it was they kind of bring out our goal of sharing the different facets of science and going beyond just the typical, academic, become a professor, normal route. And it's cool to see everything that surrounds science, all of the actors behind the scenes. So Temu's very cool in that regard.
Yeah, I think with different science facets too, not only did we talk to professors, but there's also quite a few significant scientific events from 2020. And so I think, one of the more well-known ones for me would be the Neowise comet that everyone was able to see for, I think, 2 weeks in the summer, something like that. But not many people get to see like a normal comet like that. And so seeing the comet with two tails and, having the opportunity to be able to share, like, the comets have two tails, like one for ions and one for dust, I think was a really cool opportunity that showed up for once in a lifetime in 2020.
And one thing we tried to do with our channel is that during the pandemic over the summer, it was a little bit more difficult to reach out to professors and contact them for an actual episode. And so the four of us thought of a creative solution to that was to create just like a side podcast series called Not So Serious, where we talk about different astronomy related things. And we'd also discuss during those episodes astronomy news of that week or of the past few weeks. And so we thought that this would be a good time to kind of reflect on those news stories we shared during those not so serious episodes, kind of talk about our favorite moments of 2020. So yeah, I definitely agree that the Neowise comet, I think we had an episode on comets and asteroids in the solar system, but that was definitely one of the most notable events, I'd say.
I mean, another standout was the 2020 Nobel Prize in Physics, which was given to three space people, in the sense that two of them were observational astronomers and one of them was a theoretical physicist. But giving a Nobel Prize in black holes was pretty cool, very spacey, just all around cool science stuff.
I think another event, just it was a little smaller and may not be as well known, was there was a paper that was published that basically stated that they had detected signs of life in the atmosphere of Venus. I think it was detection of phosphine in the atmosphere, and I know it's come out more that it's unlikely that that's actually true, because there have been other studies that have kind of not found the same results as this one group. But I think for me personally, like reading about that, because we did prepare it for, I believe, one of the either the news segments for NSS or just for an NSS episode, just reading about the potential of actually finding life outside of Earth was really cool. And I think detections like this, although it was a little like a bait, because we don't know if it's actually there or not.
Right.
It's just really cool to hear about, and to think that life outside of Earth may not just be alien life, other beings on another planet. It can just detect in an atmosphere. And I think that was something really cool that happened this year for me personally.
I'd also say related to that, it was interesting because for the longest time, our interests for NASA and other space companies was to look at Mars for life, just because it fell in the perfect area in terms of the Goldilocks zone. It was perfect for liquid water and the possibility of life to exist. And never had we really considered Venus, because Venus was an example of the runaway greenhouse effect, where it was super hot on the surface, and so I think sulfuric acid in the atmosphere. So it seemed that the chance for life would be quite minimal. But then all of a sudden we came out with this result where phosphine was detected in a layer above the surface that was like within a temperature range suitable for life as we know it. So that was really interesting. And then also like just after that discovery came out, all of a sudden you see like the political side of it, where all of a sudden Russia is saying, well, Venus is our planet because we were the first to land on it back during the space race. So I thought that was really interesting to see how that played out after the discovery.
And we also did a not so serious preempting the discovery of phosphine in Venus's atmosphere, and that was one of my favorite NSSs to do, because we don't really learn in school or in class how people search for extraterrestrial life or the origins of life. And what you do learn in like high school biology is pretty boring and uninteresting. But learning about how life may have started and where it may have come from was super cool. And I think it was a pretty good job of us preempting the whole "there's might be life on Venus" thing. Not that we did anything, but still interesting.
Right.
Yeah. And then finally, oh, go ahead.
Oh, it's just another angle of just there's life out there that we might not expect to be there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then so finally, I'd say my favorite moments from this past year would definitely be related to the space industry or the commercial side of space. I think our second Not So Serious episode focused on kind of the space race history and then transitioning to the current privatization of space. And so I'd say specifically the launch of the 2 astronauts by SpaceX. I think it was in late May to the International Space Station, because that was the first time since 2011, when the space shuttle was retired, that American astronauts have been launched from U.S. soil rather than using the Soyuz in Russia. And so that was definitely a notable moment in terms of like a transitional moment in terms of what was our limitations going into space, and now what lies ahead in our future. I'd say now relying more on, say, SpaceX, and in the future probably Blue Origin and other space companies. So that was one of my favorite moments. Then also recently the launch of the SpaceX Starship, even though it had crashed on its landing. I thought it was pretty interesting to see that. I think this initiative by SpaceX had only started within the past like year or so, and all of us within that year they're able to develop and launch their Starship.
Hopefully space and the interest in commercial space is kind of rebounding, and hopefully this is going to mean that we're going to have an exciting next decade in terms of space exploration and discoveries and the human story in space, because that's hopefully far from over.
Because I'd say that in previous years growing up, I never really, even though I was interested in space, none of my friends or family or other people I knew were interested in space. And then all of a sudden, because of this commercial side of space and the achievements of SpaceX and other companies like them in the past few years, like this year compared to all their years, people have been so interested in space and asking me so many questions. And I think it has to do with like SpaceX and other companies receiving all this publicity online because of all these notable achievements.
And it's no longer just the story of the US and Russia sending people in space. Lots of countries like Iran, India, China have sent rockets up in the last decade or two,
Mhm.
which is hopefully good for everyone and
It's, a,
will promote interest everywhere around the world.
it's definitely a growing field that's, just expanding. And I think people are starting to notice more and more now than they were before.
Right. And speaking of growing and expanding, I do want to touch on overall how the podcast has grown and expanded. So kind of like I mentioned earlier, transitioning to that visual format that we've been sticking to for the last couple months, wherein that first episode we had with Lamone, we rented out cameras and microphones and had it in an office building, that a conference room where we could talk in person and have it be more personable. But then obviously with COVID, we had to transition to Zoom calls and virtual media. And so I think, transitioning to that virtual media, seeing how the podcast has developed over time over that virtual media. So, the first couple episodes may not have an overlay. And then these latest few do have an overlay, and the development of Not So Serious, and how being on virtual media and everyone being busy, not necessarily being like available. I think the development of the podcast so far with virtual formatting has been really well, and I think it's something that we could continue to do, and then hopefully be able to transition to in person, COVID willing, sometime in the future. But,
Hopefully sooner rather than later.
right.
And then I also think that, as Tom or Joe mentioned earlier in the episode, we initially spent 3 or 4 months trying to plan out our podcast because we had no experience with what exactly a podcast is and how to start one. And so I'd say
Right.
I'm pretty proud of the progress we've made since then. And despite all the challenges, especially COVID. And then I'd say also, like, transitioning to a virtual platform for our podcast has taught us that when we work forwards in the future, it's with the virtual format, we're able to bring in more guests that aren't necessarily associated with our university.
Mhm.
So Alex, for example, our latest podcast episode was all the way out in Arizona. She doesn't live in Michigan, and so we don't really have the resources to fly her out here. But we were still able to have that conversation. And even if in the future the 4 of us are in the same room interviewing her, we can still have her like on the screen over Zoom or some other
Mhm.
online platform that'll do that.
Right.
I mean, another non-negligible aspect of transitioning to Zoom is making it sound fluid and not too bad. And definitely it's an added strain in terms of how you interview and how you talk and who you're looking at and all of these things. And I hope we've done a decent job, and hopefully when we're back in person, it's going to be better still. But it's definitely been an interesting transition going from talking to people with a normal interaction and then meeting people and then doing these podcasts over Zoom. And then again, the third and I think the biggest aspect is learning how to meet people for the first time virtually, because for Professor Meyer, he was the first person that we had on the virtual podcast, but the 3 of you guys already knew him beforehand.
Right.
Whereas some of our later guests, we have never met in person, which has been quite an interesting transition.
Yeah, I also think just as we continue to do more of these episodes and to learn more about the guests, like Joe mentioned, being able to talk to the guests for the first time and get to know them and not be super awkward and super timid about asking for things and just being direct about what we were and what we wanted as a podcast. I think
Mhm.
another thing that we learned to do better as we transition online, especially while we learned to, better our communication skills, was just trying to ask deeper questions and actually direct the focus of our episodes so that we actually had kind of an idea behind what we wanted from each guest. And so instead of just going through the same format of what was your background, how'd you grow up, how'd you end up here, it was kind of more just like what do you do, trying to find out more about the story, more about the person, and have a specific topics regarding them. So like for Alex's episode,
Right.
because she specializes, she's a grad student at Arizona for psychology, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, because she's there, we wanted to do a space psychology episode where we kind of focused on what astronauts go through and like the idea behind, you know, colonizing Mars and all those things. And so I think it's something that we want to continue to do more as we grow and move on from this year, just to learn, just to better our conversation skills and to have more direct topics for each episode for each guest.
Yeah.
Because these guests have very interesting, you know, research, and they have very interesting backgrounds, and they can offer a lot of insight into different topics that we find very interesting.
And I've personally liked talking to people about things that gets them excited.
Yes.
Because talking to someone about something that doesn't really interest them is kind of flat and boring. But then, and probably this is one of the reasons why we kept going with the podcast, was because our conversation with Professor Limon went so well, because we were talking about things that interested us definitely, and probably him too. And that's been, it's very, I think it's a very cool process to learn and to get to see what gets people excited about doing their jobs and liking what they're doing and liking some particular set of science, but maybe not others. So I think that's kind of that's the coolest part about having a podcast about kind of the broader aspects of science, not just the particular science itself. Talking to people about things that gets them excited is really cool.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, Joe. And then I'd say with all of this, with all that we've been discussing, it turns out there's a lot of work that goes into making a podcast. And so between the four of us, we have to deal with social media, the graphics, editing the videos, and reaching out to individuals to have on the podcast as guests, as well as like forming outlines and trying our best as co-hosts to kind of figure out what kind of insightful questions we want to ask that aren't just simple interview questions, but questions that will actually spark a real conversation between us and the guest. And so with all that, we found that it's a lot more work than we anticipated. And so with that, moving forwards, we thought it'd be a great idea to bring on additional people onto our podcast team. And so I don't know if Talon wants to pop up his camera now, but this is Talon. He's also an undergraduate friend of ours at Michigan. And we thought we'd bring him on. He's really good with graphic designs. And I think that's one of the areas we definitely need to work on, because being active on Instagram or Twitter, or working on our thumbnails for our videos on YouTube or on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, that's really important for bringing in a new audience and new subscribers, and to grow our channel. And so we thought that would be a really important kind of way to expand our podcast. So bringing on Talon. Hi, Talon.
And Michael forgot to mention, Talon is an all-around cool dude.
Oh,
True.
yes.
We let him introduce himself. He's very cute, guys.
Yeah, hello, I'm Talon. I'm an undergraduate at the University of Michigan. I'm studying microbiology, so essentially bacteria and viruses. So I very much resent what Joe said earlier about the things that you learn in biology in high school being boring, because I find it incredibly interesting. But yes, I'm going to be helping out with a lot of the behind the scenes stuff. I've done the past few thumbnails and some graphics for social media, and I'll pretty much just be helping out wherever it's needed, and I'm looking forward to doing so.
And
And
you
we're excited
recognize,
to have a new perspective as well.
and you may recognize the voice. Talon was on a previous Not So Serious Everything Astronomy news segment for about 1 minute.
I was.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was fun. That's what pulled me in, and I'd be happy to do
Yeah.
more of those if that's what the people want.
Yes.
Yeah.
We're
Being
expanding our
microbiome
team.
though, yeah, that extra perspective of, you know, being microbiome, it also opens some doorways, because he's going to be well more versed in, you know, anything like chemistry, biology, kinesiology related. And so, you know, if sometime in the future we ever wanted to make an Everything Astronomy episode with someone in any of those fields or anything kind of health related, he's definitely going to be like useful and like on the episode with us and helping us out. So
So just look out for Talon. He's joining our team permanently as our 5th member. And I do believe that we're trying to expand more, so look out for any other announcements that we end up making. I think just, moving on to just more of what we want in terms of the next year or the upcoming year. I think we're trying to transition into more of a season format. And so it was a little scattered this past year, because we were trying to learn, and adapting to the online format was difficult in terms of getting guests on. And so our uploads are a little sporadic in terms of when we could upload, because, you know, it was we were never sure when we would have a guest on or when we didn't have a guest on. And so I think just moving forward for this next year, what we're wanting to do is adapt more of a season style where we release episodes every 2 weeks. And so our goal is to have, I believe, around 8 episodes total where we have 8 guests on, and that'll span the entire term for us in terms of our school year. It'll go for around for like 4 months, I believe.
Yeah, and so our first episode hopefully will be out maybe around January 15th, that Sunday night. So we want to be consistent moving forwards with Sunday night uploads, and then every other week a new episode. This would be our upcoming year, would be our second season, and so we want to release 8 episodes every other weeks, and it'd bring us to the end of April, which corresponds to the end of our academic year at Michigan, and then we'll do a summer season, and then we'll do a fall season, and then repeat that the next year. And we're going to try to aim for 8 guests. And we've already heard back from a bunch of guests that we've already reached out to this past break, and so we're really excited to bring those people on.
Right. So just look out for that. Hopefully we'll have a lot more consistent upload schedule. So every Sunday night of every other week in the month, you can expect an episode. And then just more on our social media, we'll be more consistent with uploading like onto our social media. So you're aware of what's going on in terms of our podcast. And then, if anything else comes along, we'll definitely announce that. But for now, I think in terms of our podcast, that's what we want and what we settled on. And so I believe we'll be able to get out 8 episodes pretty consistently.
Yeah.
And then
just look out for that.
And then also we thought it'd be a great idea to bring on a more diverse group of podcast guests. And so previously we had mostly professors in the astronomy department or the climate and space department and a couple of graduate students. And I think it'd be great to continue that, have a lot of our episodes primarily focused on astronomy, but also bring in other guests that are either space related or science related in their respective fields. And so as Tommy mentioned, it's great having Talon on the team because now he can talk to, say, if we have a chemistry professor on or a bio professor, perhaps the research maybe related to space in some way, perhaps like astrobiology, but now we have Talon who's a bit more of an expert on that field than we are to talk to a professor about it. And then also we thought it'd be interesting to talk with people from space industry. So working on the commercial side of space and like how rockets are launched and the whole process that goes into that. A new field of recent is space finance, space accounting, where people work for firms and they look at the benefits of a future in space. So it'd be really interesting to have that perspective on the podcast. And finally, space policy. A lot of people seem to like the Professor Seitzer episode focused on SpaceX's launch of Starlink. So I think it'd be really interesting to kind of follow up with that episode and bring on someone that's an expert in terms of what are we allowed and not allowed to do in space moving forwards.
And I mean, as it turns out, the spectrum of human ingenuity is pretty enormous. And so setting yourself the goal of just talking about, strictly speaking, astronomical phenomenon is probably it doesn't encapsulate in everything that's going on in space, which is truly huge. So hopefully we'll try to bring on a set of guests that can better reflect in really what is going on in the space industry, the field of space, because it is much larger than just people looking at stars far away and finding and discovering cool effects and phenomena. It really does involve a huge number of people who are involved in a huge number of different activities like space policy, space law, space financing, materials engineering, biology. There's really a lot going on. So hopefully we'll be able to better, broadcast that spectrum.
And that's our latest episode with Alex was the first good example of that, where a lot of our audience, I'd say, were probably surprised to hear that, someone in psychology can get involved in space. And that when you think about it, it makes sense that, well, of course you need to kind of have an understanding of psychology in space to select the astronauts to go into space in the first place. But there's actual scientists and researchers that are involved with that. So that's what we want to kind of continue with moving forward with our podcast.
Absolutely. So I think that kind of concludes what we had planned for our Everything Astronomy holiday special. Thank you so much for listening. We hope to have piqued your interest in the forthcoming season and have a happy new year. And please don't forget to like and subscribe because, that's very nice and helpful. And yeah, see you next season.